Welcome to Sleepy History Lens. Take a deep breath, get comfortable, and leave today's worries behind. Tonight, we'll journey through forgotten moments in history, peaceful landscapes, and timeless stories, all told with a calm voice to help you relax, unwind, and drift into a restful sleep. Now dim the lights, close your eyes, and let history guide your dreams. Let's begin. Tonight, we are traveling back more than 150 years to a lonely stretch of the American coastline where the sea never truly slept. Long before satellites watched the oceans, before radio towers reached across the horizon, and before electric lights turned night into day, there were only lanterns, small flames, fragile lights. Yet thousands of sailors trusted those lights with their lives. Our story begins in the autumn of 1872 on the rocky shores of New England. Imagine a place where grey cliffs meet the endless Atlantic Ocean. Cold waves crash endlessly against ancient stone. Salt hangs in the air. The wind carries the cries of distant seabirds. Far above the water stands a lonely lighthouse. Its white tower has watched storms, wars, and generations of sailors. Most Americans have never heard its story, but if these stones could speak, they would tell us about courage, loss, and a secret that quietly shaped the future of a nation. So, settle in, take a slow breath, and let us begin. The lighthouse was cared for by a man named Elias Turner. He was 58 years old. His beard had turned silver long before his time. Years of ocean wind had carved quiet lines across his face. Every morning before sunrise, Elias climbed 112 narrow stone steps to the lantern room. The climb had become part of his life, step after step, day after day, year after year. Inside the glass lantern room, he carefully cleaned each pane. He polished the great brass lamp until it reflected the morning light. Then he trimmed the wick with practiced hands. Every evening, just before darkness settled over the Atlantic, he lit the great lantern. Its warm golden light stretched nearly 20 miles across the sea. To passing sailors, that single light meant safety, home, hope. Few ever knew the name of the man who kept it burning. Life followed a gentle rhythm. The ocean decided every day's beginning. Before breakfast, Elias inspected the weather. He checked the pressure glass hanging beside the kitchen window. He wrote careful notes into a thick leather journal. Wind direction, wave height, cloud movement. Every observation mattered. Ships depended on accurate records. Outside, small fishing boats drifted toward deeper water. Children waved from the shoreline. Smoke rose peacefully from tiny cottages. The village below was small. Only a few hundred people called it home. Everyone knew everyone, and everyone trusted the lighthouse, and everyone trusted Elias. To many people, the Atlantic Ocean seemed beautiful. To Elias, it was alive. He believed the sea had moods. Some mornings it whispered softly, other days it growled with warning. He could often predict a storm simply by watching the waves. Young sailors laughed at his old-fashioned wisdom. Experienced captains never did. Many claimed the lighthouse keeper could read the ocean like others read a book. Perhaps they were right, because on one quiet October evening, the sea began saying something unusual. Just before sunset, a horse approached the narrow coastal road. Its rider wore a long, dark coat covered with dust from many miles of travel. Behind him hung a leather satchel sealed with wax. He stopped at the lighthouse gate. Without saying much, he handed Elias a single envelope. The seal bore the mark of the United States government. There was no return address, no explanation. Only one sentence was written across the front, to be opened only after the first winter storm. The rider tipped his hat, then disappeared into the growing evening fog. Elias stood silently with the envelope in his hands. The wind had grown colder. Far out at sea, a lonely ship's bell echoed through the mist. The last colors of autumn slowly faded beneath the horizon. Shades of gold and crimson gave way to deep blue twilight. The Atlantic became almost black, reflecting only a faint ribbon of fading light across its restless surface. As he had done thousands of times before, Elias climbed the winding staircase. The familiar stone steps echoed softly beneath his heavy boots. Each step carried memories. Each turn reminded him of another season, another storm, another ship safely guided home. When he reached the lantern room, he paused for a moment. From this height, the world felt wonderfully quiet. The village below had already begun lighting candles inside its small wooden homes. Thin streams of smoke drifted gently from their chimneys. Fishing boats had returned to harbor. Children hurried indoors before the cold evening breeze became stronger. Everything appeared peaceful. Everything appeared ordinary. Yet somewhere deep inside, Elias felt that something had changed. The mysterious letter rested quietly inside his thick wool coat. Its weight seemed far heavier than paper should ever feel. Elias carefully filled the great lamp with fresh whale oil. He inspected every brass fitting. He adjusted the wick with slow, practiced hands. There was no room for mistakes. A lantern that burned too brightly wasted precious fuel. A lantern that burned too dimly could cost innocent lives. Finally, he struck a single wooden match. The tiny flame danced gently. For just a moment it seemed almost fragile. Then the great lamp awakened. Golden light filled the lantern room. The enormous glass lens captured every beam and sent it sweeping across the Atlantic in slow, graceful circles. Far beyond the cliffs, invisible ships now knew they were not alone. Somewhere in the darkness, weary captains smiled with quiet relief. The lighthouse had spoken.
Every lighthouse carries stories. Most are never written down. Elias often believed the ocean remembered every ship that had ever crossed its waters. Merchant vessels carrying tea, immigrant families searching for a new beginning, whaling ships returning after months at sea, naval vessels still bearing the scars of the Civil War. Each had passed this very shore, some safely, others never arrived. The sea rarely explained its choices. It simply kept its secrets. Sometimes, during long winter nights, Elias imagined hearing voices carried by the wind. Not frightening voices, only distant echoes, as though generations of sailors were quietly thanking the lonely lantern that had once guided them through darkness. Before retiring each evening, Elias opened his weather journal. Its leather cover had faded from decades of use. Inside were thousands of careful observations. Some pages described fierce blizzards, others recorded calm summer mornings when the sea looked as smooth as polished glass. Tonight's entry was unusually short. October 18th, 1772. The wind has changed. The birds flew inland before sunset. The sea feels unrestless. Received an unexpected government letter. Instructions remain unopened. Something tells me this winter will not resemble the others. He gently closed the journal, blew out the candle, and listened. Only the sound of waves answered him. The following morning arrived strangely silent. No gulls circled above the cliffs, no fishing boats hurried toward open water. Even the wind seemed to be holding its breath. The villagers noticed it too. Old fishermen exchanged quiet glances. They had lived beside the Atlantic long enough to recognize unusual mornings. Nature often whispered before it shouted. Far beyond the horizon, dark clouds slowly gathered. Not ordinary storm clouds, these moved with unusual purpose, like an enormous curtain slowly closing across the sea. Elias looked toward the distant horizon. Then, without speaking a word, he reached into his coat. His fingers touched the sealed government envelope once again, but the instructions were clear. Not yet. Only after the first winter storm. He slipped it carefully back into his pocket. Above him, the lighthouse lantern continued turning, patient, steady, faithful, completely unaware that before long its light would guide far more than passing ships.
Pale grey skies and restless winds. Every morning, Elias Turner climbed the lighthouse tower as he always had, yet something felt different. The Atlantic had grown strangely silent. Even the fishermen who had spent their lives on these waters chose to remain close to shore. On the evening of November 3rd, 1872, the first winter storm finally arrived. It began with a cold wind from the northeast. By midnight, rain lashed against the lighthouse windows. Soon, rain turned to sleet, then snow. Powerful waves exploded against the black rocks below, sending icy spray high into the darkness. The lighthouse trembled with every crashing wave, yet its great lantern never stopped turning. Its warm golden beam swept across the raging Atlantic, again and again, like a promise that refused to fade. Just after midnight, Elias descended the narrow stone staircase. His boots echoed through the silent tower. He removed his heavy wool coat, then reached into the inside pocket. The envelope was still there. Its red wax seal remained unbroken. He remembered every word written across the front, to be opened only after the first winter storm. Outside, the wind roared louder than ever. Elias lit a small candle. Its flame flickered wildly. With careful hands, he broke the ancient wax seal. Inside was a single folded letter. The paper carried the official seal of the United States Lighthouse Board, but what caught his attention most was the signature at the bottom. Not a president, not a governor, only one mysterious name, Captain Nathaniel Brooks, a man Elias believed dead for nearly 10 years. The letter contained only a few paragraphs, yet every sentence carried unusual weight. If this letter has reached you, then our greatest fear has returned. Somewhere beyond Cape Older lies a ship that officially never existed. If she appears again during winter, no one except you must guide her safely to harbor. Trust no stranger, tell no official. Burn this letter after reading. The future of our country may depend upon your silence. Elias read the words twice, then a third time. The room suddenly felt colder. Captain Brooks had fought beside him during the final months of the Civil War. They had shared impossible nights, impossible secrets, and Brooks had vanished shortly after peace returned. Most believed he had drowned. Others whispered that he had accepted a government mission so secret his name had simply disappeared from history. The storm outside reminded Elias of another winter, the winter of 1864. Cannons had echoed across distant rivers. Smoke had darkened the sky. Young soldiers marched into battle carrying dreams they would never bring home. Elias had never spoken about those years, not to the villagers, not even to himself. War changes a man quietly. Sometimes the deepest scars cannot be seen. Captain Nathaniel Brooks had once saved Elias's life beneath enemy fire. Before they parted ways, Brooks had spoken strange words. One day the country may ask for your help again. When it does, do not refuse. For 10 years, Elias believed those words belonged only to memory. Tonight, they suddenly felt very real.
Just before dawn, the storm weakened. Snow continued falling softly. The Atlantic remained rough, but the wind had begun to settle. Elias climbed once more to the lantern room. He lifted his brass telescope toward the eastern horizon. At first, he saw nothing, only waves, mist, and drifting snow. Then, far beyond the reach of ordinary sight, a single dark shape slowly emerged from the fog. Not a fishing boat, not a merchant ship, something larger, older. Its tall masts appeared like ghosts rising from the sea. No flags flew above its deck, no smoke drifted from its chimney. It moved in complete silence, as though the ocean itself carried it forward. Elias lowered the telescope. His heart beat slowly but steadily. After all these years, Captain Brooks had been right. The ship had returned. Elias kept the brass telescope fixed upon the distant silhouette. Minute by minute, the vessel became clearer. She was a 3-masted schooner, weathered by countless years at sea. Her sails were faded, almost silver beneath the pale winter sky. What troubled Elias was not her appearance, it was her silence. Every ship made noise, the creak of timber, the snap of canvas, the voices of sailors. But this vessel moved across the water without a single sound. Even the gulls refused to fly near her. The lighthouse keeper lowered the telescope and whispered to himself, "I've seen you before." The memory remained just beyond his reach, like a dream fading with the morning light. Back inside the lighthouse, Elias unlocked a small oak chest. Few people knew it existed. Inside lay a collection of maps that dated back nearly 30 years. Their edges had yellowed with age. Some had been drawn by Navy surveyors, others by whaling captains who had crossed the Atlantic long before steamships ruled the sea. Slowly, Elias unrolled the oldest chart. His finger traced the familiar coastline. Then it stopped. A tiny handwritten note appeared near a dangerous reef. Deep harbor, known only to trusted keepers. He closed his eyes. Captain Brooks had once shown him this hidden passage, a narrow channel invisible to strangers, safe enough for experienced sailors, deadly for everyone else. If the mysterious schooner truly sought refuge, only Elias could guide her safely through the rocks. By afternoon, snow covered the rooftops of the little fishing village. Children laughed as they chased one another through fresh drifts. Fishermen repaired nets inside warm boathouses. Women baked fresh bread while smoke curled from stone chimneys. Life continued as it always had. No one noticed the strange ship waiting beyond the fog. No one except Elias. He watched from the lighthouse balcony. The vessel never moved closer, never drifted farther away. It simply waited, patiently, as though it understood that its moment had not yet arrived. The old keeper felt a quiet chill, not from the cold,
but from the feeling that someone aboard the ship was watching the lighthouse in return. That evening, just after the lighthouse lantern had been lit, a gentle knock echoed through the tower. 3 slow knocks, then silence. Elias opened the heavy wooden door. Standing outside was a young boy, no older than 12. His cheeks were red from the freezing wind. In his gloved hands rested a small wooden box. "My grandfather asked me to bring this to you," the boy said softly. "Who is your grandfather?" Elias asked. The boy smiled. "Captain Brooks." Before Elias could speak again, a sudden gust of snow swept across the path. The boy stepped backward into the white mist. For only a heartbeat, then he was gone. No footprints remained, only the little wooden box. Inside the box lay a beautifully crafted brass compass. Its polished surface reflected the warm glow of the fireplace. Unlike any ordinary compass, its needle did not point north. Instead, it slowly turned towards the sea. Attached beneath it was a folded note. Only 6 words had been written. "Trust the compass, not the stars." Elias stared into the dancing fire. Outside, snow continued falling without pause. Far beyond the cliffs, the silent schooner waited beneath the fading evening sky. And somewhere across those icy waters, a secret buried since the Civil War was beginning to awaken. The longest winter of Elias Turner's life had only just begun. The snow continued to fall through the long night. By dawn, the lighthouse stood wrapped in white, its tall stone walls dusted with fresh snow. Inside, the strange brass compass rested quietly upon Elias Turner's wooden table. Its needle still refused to point north. Instead, it pointed steadily toward the sea. Elias picked it up. The brass felt unusually warm in his weathered hands. He slipped it into his coat and climbed to the lantern room one final time before sunrise. Outside, the Atlantic stretched into an endless blanket of grey. The mysterious schooner remained exactly where it had been the day before, waiting. Not drifting, not anchored, simply waiting. Elias understood. The ship was waiting for him. For many years, he had believed his greatest adventures were behind him. He had become a lighthouse keeper, a quiet guardian of the coast. But now, history had come looking for him once again. Leaving the lighthouse behind, Elias followed a narrow path that wound down the frozen cliffs. Few people knew this trail existed. It had been carved by sailors generations earlier. Hidden beneath thick pine trees lay a small wooden rowboat. Its paint had faded long ago, yet it remained sturdy. Elias untied the rope. The old compass immediately turned toward a narrow opening between 2 towering cliffs. To anyone unfamiliar with these waters, the passage appeared impossible. Jagged rocks waited just beneath the waves. Strong currents twisted unpredictably. Many captains had avoided this place for fear of losing their ships, yet Captain Nathaniel Brooks once called it the safest secret on the Atlantic. With slow, steady strokes, Elias guided the rowboat into the hidden channel. The towering cliffs swallowed every sound. Only the gentle splash of oars disturbed the silence. After nearly an hour, the narrow passage opened into a place few Americans had ever seen. A perfectly sheltered harbor, protected from every storm, hidden completely from the open sea. The water inside was calm as polished glass. Towering cliffs surrounded it from every side. Even the wind seemed unable to enter. Waiting silently upon those peaceful waters was the mysterious schooner. She appeared even older up close. Her dark wooden hull bore countless scars.
Her sails had been carefully repaired many times. Yet one detail caught Elias's attention immediately. The American flag flew proudly from her stern. Its stars numbered 37, a flag no longer used, a flag from another time. A narrow wooden gangway slowly lowered from the ship. One man stepped onto it. He wore a long navy blue officer's coat. His beard had turned white. His posture remained perfectly straight. When he removed his hat, Elias stopped rowing. For several silent moments, neither man spoke. Instead, time seemed to pause. Finally, the stranger smiled gently. "My old friend," he said, "you've kept the light burning." Elias whispered only 2 words: "Captain Brooks." The years had changed them both, yet neither had forgotten the other. Brooks stepped forward. "The country needs you again." Inside the captain's cabin, Brooks unlocked a polished oak chest. Carefully, he removed a leather-bound portfolio. Its seal had never been broken. The wax still carried the emblem of the United States government. Brooks placed it on the table. "This," he said quietly, "was delivered from Washington 11 years ago. It has remained unopened ever since." Elias looked at him with surprise. "Why wait so long?" Brooks smiled. "Because it was addressed to both of us." Slowly, the captain broke the ancient seal. Inside lay dozens of handwritten pages. The first sentence read, "For the preservation of the Union, this mission shall never be recorded in the official history of the United States." Outside, snow continued falling softly over the hidden harbor. Inside the little cabin, 2 old friends prepared to uncover a secret powerful enough to vanish from history itself. The cabin grew silent. Only the gentle creaking of the old schooner could be heard as it rested peacefully in the hidden harbor. Captain Brooks carefully unfolded the first page. The handwriting was elegant. Every line had been written with remarkable precision. At the top of the document appeared the Great Seal of the United States. Below it were the words, "Confidential, to be opened only by those entrusted with the Northern Coastal Watch." Elias slowly adjusted his spectacles. He had expected military orders. Instead, he found something far more unusual. The document spoke of a network of lighthouse keepers stretching from the rocky coast of Maine to the shores of Virginia. Ordinary men, quiet men, men whose names would never appear in history books. Yet together they formed a silent chain of guardians who protected the nation long after the Civil War had ended. The lighthouse was more than a beacon. It was a watchtower. Brooks pointed toward a large map. Tiny red circles marked dozens of lighthouses along the Atlantic coast. Each represented a trusted keeper. Each had sworn an oath of silence. They observed unusual ships, recorded strange movements, passed coded messages from one lighthouse to the next using carefully timed lantern signals. No telegraph was faster during a violent storm. No government office was more reliable than a man who never abandoned his light. For years, the system had protected merchant ships, naval vessels, and isolated coastal towns, yet few people even knew it existed. Whispers. "It was never about glory," Brooks said quietly. "It was always about duty." Elias nodded. Some of the names on the map belonged to old friends. Many had already passed away. Their lights had gone dark. Captain Brooks unlocked another small chest. Inside rested a thick leather-bound logbook. Its pages were filled with careful handwriting, dates, weather, ships, unusual sightings. Some entries were ordinary, others raised questions. One page read, January 1868, strange lights observed beyond Cape Alder. No known vessel reported. Another entry stated, February 1869, unknown schooner delivered sealed cargo under heavy fog. Elias slowly turned another page. There, written in fresh ink, only a few weeks earlier, were the words, "The watch must awaken again." He looked up. Who wrote this? Brooks answered softly, "I did."
Snow continued drifting quietly outside the cabin windows. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Instead, they listened to the peaceful sound of water gently touching the hull. Finally, Brooks broke the silence. "Do you remember the promise we made in 1865? Elias smiled faintly. "I remember every word." They had stood together on a quiet Virginia shoreline shortly after the war had ended. The nation was healing, cities were rebuilding, families searched for loved ones who would never return. That evening they had promised that if America ever needed silent guardians again, neither of them would refuse. Some promises fade with time, others grow stronger, even after decades. Night slowly settled over the hidden harbor. Captain Brooks climbed onto the deck carrying an old brass lantern. He lit its flame. Then, with calm precision, he covered and uncovered the light in a carefully practiced rhythm. 3 flashes, a pause. 2 flashes, another pause. 1 final flash. Elias watched carefully. Within moments, far beyond the cliffs, a tiny light appeared on the distant shoreline. His lighthouse. Someone had answered the signal. Brooks smiled. The watch is still alive. Across the cold Atlantic coast, one forgotten lighthouse after another began shining through the darkness. Not as warnings, not as guides for ships, but as silent voices calling to each other across the night. Their mission had begun once more.
The morning arrived beneath a sky the color of iron. Not a single patch of blue could be seen above the Atlantic. The air was strangely still. Even the seabirds had disappeared from the cliffs. Old fishermen often said that when nature became too quiet, it was preparing to speak with great force. "It has begun," Brooks whispered. Elias understood immediately. This was no ordinary winter storm. It was a powerful nor'easter, one capable of swallowing ships, destroying piers, and isolating entire coastal villages for days. The hidden harbor would offer some protection, but the small lighthouse village beyond the cliffs remained exposed to the full strength of the Atlantic. Without another word, Elias climbed into his rowboat. His place was not aboard the schooner. His place was where the lantern still burned. The narrow channel had become far more dangerous. The tide was rising. Cold waves surged between the towering cliffs. Snow mixed with freezing rain, covering the wooden oars with a thin layer of ice. Still, Elias rowed steadily. He knew every rock beneath the water, every hidden current, every bend in the passage. Above him, tall pine trees bent under the growing wind. Their branches groaned softly. By the time he reached the open sea, the first great waves were already crashing against the coastline. Far above the cliffs, the white lighthouse stood alone, its lantern still turned faithfully, waiting as though welcoming its keeper home. Back in the village, every family was preparing for the storm. Windows were covered with wooden shutters. Fishing boats were pulled high onto the shore. Barrels of fresh water were stored inside homes. Children carried firewood, while their parents secured rooftops against the coming wind. The church bell rang slowly across the harbor, not as a warning, but as a reminder. The people gathered briefly inside the small chapel. They prayed quietly for the fishermen still at sea, for the travelers who had not yet reached home, and for the old lighthouse keeper who never abandoned his post. When the prayers ended, each family returned in silence. The village trusted the lighthouse, and the lighthouse trusted Elias. Inside the lighthouse, Elias began his familiar routine. He cleaned every pane of glass. He inspected the great Fresnel lens. He filled the lantern with fresh whale oil. He checked every gear that turned the rotating light. Outside, the wind screamed around the tower. Snow struck the windows like handfuls of sand. The lighthouse shook beneath the force of the storm. Yet inside, everything remained calm. Every movement was slow, every action deliberate. Experience had taught Elias that panic solved nothing. A steady hand could save lives. As darkness fell, the great lantern came alive once more. Its golden beam reached into the storm, searching patiently through snow and darkness.
Night settled over New England. The storm had reached its full strength. Visibility had fallen to almost nothing. Then, through the blowing snow, Elias noticed something remarkable. Far to the north, a distant lighthouse flashed. Moments later, another answered from the south. Then another, and another. One by one, forgotten keepers across the Atlantic coast repeated the coded lantern signals Captain Brooks had taught them long ago. The watch had awakened. Though separated by many miles, each keeper stood alone inside his own lighthouse. Yet together, they formed an unbroken chain of light stretching across the American coastline. The ocean could hide ships, the storm could silence voices, but neither could extinguish the quiet courage of those who kept the lanterns burning. And somewhere beyond the blinding snow, a ship was sailing towards them. The storm raged through the night with unrelenting force. Snow spun wildly around the lantern room, making the great beam appear like a golden ribbon drifting through white clouds. Elias stood beside the towering Fresnel lens, watching each slow rotation. Then, for only a heartbeat, he saw it, a faint light, far beyond the reef. It disappeared almost as quickly as it had appeared. He waited. Another rotation. Again the tiny light flashed through the snow. It was not lightning. It was not another lighthouse. It was a ship's lantern. Somewhere in the darkness, a captain was searching desperately for the safety of the coast. Elias reached for his telescope. The glass was nearly useless in the storm, yet he could just make out the outline of a struggling vessel. She was being pushed towards the jagged rocks. Time was running out. Without hesitation, Elias climbed down the narrow staircase. At the base of the tower hung an enormous bronze bell. For decades it had warned sailors when fog hid the shoreline. Tonight it would serve its purpose once more. He grasped the thick rope. The first strike echoed across the cliffs. A deep, powerful sound rolled over the sea. Again the bell rang, and again. Its voice traveled farther than any shout ever could. Across the village, doors opened. Families listened quietly. The fishermen understood immediately. A ship was in danger. Several men hurried towards the harbor, carrying ropes, lanterns, and heavy wool blankets. Though the sea was too violent for rescue boats, they refused to stand idle. Far beyond the crashing waves, Captain Brooks watched from the deck of the mysterious schooner. He knew exactly where the distressed ship was headed, straight toward the hidden channel. Only one narrow path led safely through those rocks. Any mistake would end in disaster. Brooks lifted his own brass lantern. Following the ancient code, he flashed 3 slow signals towards the lighthouse. Moments later, Elias answered. The 2 old friends could not hear one another, yet no words were needed. Together, they created a corridor of light. The lighthouse illuminated the entrance. The schooner's lantern marked the safe passage.
Between those two faithful lights lay the only route to safety. Slowly, very slowly, the struggling ship answered the signals. Her bow turned away from the deadly reef. The frightened crew followed the dancing lanterns through the blizzard. For long minutes, no one on shore could tell whether they had succeeded. Then, a powerful wave lifted the vessel one final time. She slipped between the towering cliffs. The sea suddenly became calm. The hidden harbor had embraced another ship. Back at the lighthouse, Elias allowed himself a quiet smile, not because the mission had been completed, but because lives had been spared. For him, that had always been enough. Just before sunrise, the wind began to fade. Snowflakes drifted gently instead of flying wildly. The Atlantic, though still restless, had survived another night. Golden light slowly spread across the eastern horizon. The lighthouse stood exactly as it had for generations, strong, silent, faithful. Below, villagers emerged from their homes. Children laughed as they stepped into fresh snow. Fishermen looked toward the sea with quiet gratitude. None of them knew how close disaster had come. None of them knew of the hidden harbor or the secret network of lantern keepers stretching along the American coast. And that was exactly as Elias and Captain Brooks intended. Some heroes never seek recognition. Some victories are measured not by applause, but by the simple fact that another sunrise has arrived. As the first rays of morning touched the lighthouse windows, Elias looked toward the distant sea. The greatest challenge still lay ahead.
The great storm had finally passed. For the first time in many days, the Atlantic Ocean breathed peacefully. Gentle waves rolled across the water, reflecting the pale colors of a winter sunrise. The air remained cold, but it no longer carried the anger of the storm. From the balcony of the lighthouse, Elias Turner watched fishing boats slowly return to the sea. Children waved to their fathers from the snowy shoreline. Smoke drifted lazily from the chimneys of the village. Everything looked ordinary once again. Yet Elias knew the quiet would not last. Far beyond the horizon, the mysterious schooner waited in the hidden harbor. Captain Brooks had promised to reveal the true reason for his return. Today, the answer would finally be known. Elias buttoned his heavy wool coat, tucked the brass compass safely into his pocket, and made his way toward the narrow path leading down the cliffs. For perhaps a last time, he left the lighthouse behind. Captain Brooks greeted Elias with a warm smile as he stepped aboard the schooner. The ship rested peacefully in the hidden harbor. No longer mysterious, she seemed almost welcoming. Captain Brooks led his old friend below deck. The captain's cabin was quiet and warm. Maps covered one wall. Brass instruments rested neatly upon polished shelves. At the center of the room stood a large oak chest secured by 3 iron locks. Brooks removed 3 different keys from around his neck. One by one, the locks opened. Inside rested no gold, no silver, no weapons. Instead, hundreds of carefully wrapped journals, leather-bound books, handwritten maps, letters, ship logs, weather records, personal diaries from lighthouse keepers all along the Atlantic coast. Elias stared in silence. "This," Brooks said gently, "is the memory of the sea." Brooks carefully lifted one of the journals. Its pages dated back to the year 1815. Another had been written during the War of 1812.
Others described hurricanes, shipwrecks, rescues, the arrival of immigrant families seeking new lives in America. Every lighthouse keeper had quietly recorded history. Not the history of famous politicians, not the history of great battles, but the history of ordinary people. Fishermen, mothers, children, sailors, merchants, people whose names had never appeared in newspapers, yet together their stories formed the living heartbeat of a young nation. For 50 years, Brooks explained, these journals have traveled from lighthouse to lighthouse. They belong to every generation, and now they belong to the future. Captain Brooks unrolled a large map of the American East Coast. One location had been marked with fresh ink: Washington, Washington. The government wants these records protected, Brooks said quietly. Not inside military forts, not inside government offices. They must be placed where scholars, teachers, and future generations may one day discover them. Elias nodded slowly. He understood. History did not belong only to those in power. It belonged to everyone. Brooks looked toward the cabin window. My health is failing. My voyage is nearly over. I need someone I trust to finish the journey. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Finally, Elias smiled. As long as the sea allows me, I'll help you. By late afternoon, the tide had turned. The schooner's sails slowly filled with a gentle winter breeze. Crew members quietly raised the anchor. The hidden harbor reflected the pale sky like polished glass. Elias stood at the stern beside Captain Brooks. Behind them, the white lighthouse stood proudly upon its rocky cliff. Its lantern shone even in daylight. A familiar sight, a comforting sight. Perhaps a final farewell. As the schooner slipped through the secret passage and returned to the open Atlantic, the lighthouse became smaller and smaller. Yet its light remained visible, steady, faithful. A reminder that no matter how far one travels, there is always a light waiting to guide the way home. For the next several days, the schooner followed the American coastline. Winter painted the landscape in quiet shades of silver and white. To the east stretched the endless Atlantic. To the west, forests, villages, and distant church steeples appeared through the morning mist. The voyage was unhurried. Captain Brooks had learned long ago that the sea rewarded patience. Each sunrise brought a different sky. Some mornings were filled with soft pink clouds. Others arrived beneath blankets of grey. Every evening, Elias climbed to the quarterdeck. He watched the lighthouse beams of distant shores sweep slowly across the dark water. Each light reminded him that another keeper stood faithfully at his post. Though they had never met, they shared the same purpose: to guide, to protect, to endure. That evening the sea became as smooth as polished glass. Above, countless stars filled the winter sky. The crew gathered quietly on deck after supper. There was no music, no celebration, only gentle conversation. Captain Brooks opened one of the old journals. He began reading the words of a lighthouse keeper who had written them more than 40 years earlier. The pages spoke of ordinary moments: a child waving from the shore, a fishing boat returning safely after a storm, a lonely sailor finding comfort in the distant glow of a lighthouse. The crew listened in silence. They realized the journals held something far more valuable than treasure. They preserved memories that would otherwise disappear forever. Elias smiled softly. Perhaps history was not only written by famous people. Perhaps it was written by anyone who chose kindness over fear.
Among the crew, was a young deckhand named Samuel. He had recently celebrated his 19th birthday. Every evening, he asked Elias questions. "What is the hardest part of being a lighthouse keeper?" Elias thought carefully before answering. "It is not the storms. It is not the loneliness. It is remembering that someone you will never meet may depend upon your light." Samuel nodded thoughtfully. The answer stayed with him. Later that night, he climbed to the bow of the ship. Looking toward the distant horizon, he quietly whispered, "I hope one day I can be someone's light." Elias heard the words. He smiled. The future always begins with quiet promises. Several days later, the schooner entered the broad waters of the Chesapeake. The wind carried the scent of pine forests and distant fireplaces. Small sailboats crossed the calm bay. Merchant vessels unloaded barrels of flour, tobacco, and timber at busy docks. Life moved at its usual rhythm. No one recognized the old schooner. No one knew she carried decades of forgotten journals beneath her deck. Captain Brooks climbed to the highest point on the ship. Far in the distance, a faint glow appeared on the horizon. Washington, not yet close enough to see its buildings, only the warm light of a growing capital. Elias stood beside his old friend. Neither man spoke. They simply watched the fading light. After many years, after countless storms, after promises kept in silence, their journey was nearing its end. But both understood an important truth. The greatest legacy is not fame. It is leaving behind something that helps those who come after us. As darkness settled over the quiet sea, the schooner continued toward the nation's capital, carrying not gold, not weapons, but stories. Stories waiting patiently for future generations to remember.
Several days after leaving the Chesapeake, the old schooner reached the quiet docks near Washington. Morning fog drifted slowly above the broad river. The growing capital stirred gently to life. Horse-drawn wagons rolled across cobblestone streets. Shopkeepers opened their wooden shutters. Government clerks hurried toward brick buildings, carrying leather satchels filled with papers. To most people, the weathered schooner appeared to be just another coastal vessel. No crowds gathered at the dock, no military band played, no newspaper reporters waited to record its arrival. And that was exactly how Captain Brooks wanted it. Some journeys were meant to remain unnoticed. Some victories belonged only to those who quietly carried them. Together, Elias and Brooks carefully unloaded the heavy oak chest that contained decades of journals, maps, weather logs, and letters. Each page carried the voices of ordinary Americans. Each page had survived storms, wars, and countless winters. Now, they had finally reached their destination. Inside a quiet stone building stood an elderly archivist named Margaret Hale. She greeted Captain Brooks with a respectful nod. No questions were asked, no signatures were required. She simply unlocked a heavy iron door leading into a cool underground archive. Shelves lined every wall. Ancient books rested beside carefully labeled maps. Margaret gently placed one of the Lighthouse journals on a reading table. She smiled. She said softly, "These are not merely records. They are the heartbeat of a young nation." Elias looked around the room. He realized something beautiful. Long after ships had vanished, long after storms had passed, these stories would continue speaking. Perhaps not today,
Perhaps not tomorrow, but someday, someone would open these pages and remember. With the mission complete, Elias returned north. The familiar lighthouse welcomed him exactly as it always had. The stone tower stood proudly against the Atlantic sky. The villagers gathered quietly as he walked home. Children waved. Fishermen tipped their hats. No one knew where he had been. No one asked. In small coastal towns, people understood that some journeys were personal. That evening, Elias climbed the 112 stone steps for what he believed might be his final winter. He cleaned the great Fresnel lens one last time. He polished the brass lamp. Then, as the sun disappeared beneath the horizon, he lit the lantern. Its warm golden light swept across the sea, just as it had thousands of evenings before. Winter slowly faded into spring. The sea softened. The days grew longer. One peaceful evening, Elias sat outside the lighthouse, watching the sun melt into the Atlantic. He thought about Captain Brooks, about the journals, about every sailor who had ever followed the lighthouse beam through darkness. He realized something simple. No single person changes history alone. History is built quietly, by countless ordinary people, doing ordinary things with extraordinary care. A lighthouse keeper trimming a lantern wick, a fisherman sharing his catch, a teacher opening an old journal, a child listening to a forgotten story. Together, these small acts become the foundation upon which nations stand. The wind carried the scent of salt and pine. The lighthouse lantern began its familiar circle, slow, steady, endless. Years passed. Eventually another keeper took Elias Turner's place. The lantern continued to shine. The village continued to grow. Children became parents. Parents became grandparents. Generations came and went. Yet every evening, as darkness settled over the Atlantic, the lighthouse welcomed sailors home. Somewhere inside a quiet archive, the journals remained safe, waiting patiently, waiting for future readers, waiting for curious minds. As for Elias Turner, history never placed his name inside famous textbooks. No great monument honored his service, but perhaps that was never important, because every ship that reached home safely, every family reunited after a voyage, every child who grew up with a parent returning from the sea carried a small piece of his legacy. And so, as our story comes gently to its end, imagine the sound of distant waves, the quiet cry of seabirds, the warm glow of a lantern turning through the night. Some lights are built of flame, others are built of kindness, duty, and hope. May we all leave behind a light that helps someone find their way home. Good night, and thank you for walking these quiet shores with me. Nearly 50 winters passed. The Atlantic Ocean continued its endless conversation with the rocky shores of New England. Storms came, storms faded. New ships crossed the horizon where old sailing vessels had once ruled the sea. Steam engines slowly replaced canvas sails. Telegraph wires connected distant cities. America continued to grow. Yet every evening, as daylight slowly disappeared, the lighthouse awakened once again. Its warm light swept quietly across the darkening water. Few people remembered the name of Elias Turner, but the light he had protected still welcomed weary sailors home. The tower had become more than stone. It had become a symbol, a quiet reminder that some duties are never truly finished.
One autumn afternoon, a young school teacher climbed the narrow path leading toward the lighthouse. She carried a leather notebook beneath her arm. Her students had asked a simple question.
Who was the first lighthouse keeper here? No official records offered much information. Only a few faded photographs remained. The current keeper welcomed her inside. Together they climbed the familiar spiral staircase, 112 stone steps, exactly as Elias had climbed so many years before. Inside the lantern room, sunlight poured through the great glass lens. Dust danced gently in the golden beams. The teacher placed her hand upon the polished brass railing. She smiled quietly. "This place remembers," she whispered. Far away, inside the quiet archive in Washington, another pair of hands carefully opened one of the old journals. Its leather cover had softened with age. Its pages carried the scent of salt, paper, and time. The historian turned slowly through the entries. Weather observations, rescue accounts, simple notes written by men who expected no recognition. Then he paused. One sentence caught his attention. "The greatest reward is seeing another sunrise." No signature appeared beneath the words, only a date, November. The historian smiled gently. Sometimes history speaks in whispers instead of headlines, and perhaps those whispers last the longest. Thank you for joining this peaceful journey through a fictional chapter inspired by America's lighthouse heritage. As the waves continue their endless rhythm and the lantern keeps turning through the night, may you find the same quiet comfort that generations of sailors once found in its gentle light. Good night, and sleep peacefully.